Shalom, shalom. Welcome, everyone. We're so thrilled to have you here with us, wherever you are in the world today, learning with us. And we are thrilled today to be able to learn about anti-Semitism in Australia. I mean, we're not thrilled to learn that it exists, but thrilled to have an opportunity to unpack that issue and beyond with Rabbanit Nomi Kaltmann, who is a lawyer, journalist, educator, and political strategist. She's held senior roles working across law and media and politics. Nomi is a monthly columnist for the Jewish Independent and previously served as the Australian correspondent for Tablet magazine in New York. Her commentary and reporting have appeared in the Griffith Review, The Guardian, The Age, Crikey, Mamamia, ABC Religion and News, ABC Religion and Ethics, The Spectator, and The Daily Beast, amongst others. She's a sought-after writing teacher focusing on opinion editorial writing, working with professionals and creatives on how to get published. She holds a Bachelor of Laws and Bachelor of Arts from Monash University and a Master's in Legal Practice from the Australian National University. In 2020, Rabbanit Nomi ran as a Climate 200 endorsed independent candidate in the Victorian state election. Representing the seat of Caulfield, Nomi's campaign was featured in the Australian Financial Review, Guardian, Australia, and The Age. Nomi is one of the founding members of the Women's Orthodox Tefillah Group in Victoria. In 2023, she graduated from Yeshivat Maharat and is also the founder and inaugural president of JOFA in Australia. Nomi is very involved in interfaith work and spent many years as a board member of the Faith Communities Council of Victoria. She's an in-demand interfaith speaker on gender, religion, and civic leadership. She regularly presents to schools, universities, and public forums on Judaism, ethics, and the Holocaust. So oftentimes in America, we think there's two places. There's Israel and there's America. That's where the Jews are. It turns out there's Jews in other places too, in North America, in South America, in South Africa, in Europe, in Australia, and other places. And so it's important that we continue to expand our consciousness around the various dimensions of what Jewish experience is like, and how Israel can be united in understanding and in dialogue with each other. So with that, Rabbanit Nomi, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's Thursday morning in Australia. The future looks bright. I've been told it's like 3 or 4 p.m. in Arizona and it's 7 p.m. in New York. So you know what they say, there's 2 hemispheres. And we're doing well in the Southern Hemisphere and the future definitely looks bright. I have my baby strapped to me, so if you hear some funny noises, my baby has just gone to sleep, so hopefully she's not going to interrupt us. And I'm going to talk about the Australian Jewish community today. So I know, like Rabbi Shmuley said, around the world, from an American context, you're generally thinking about Israel and you're generally thinking about America and sometimes South America. But outside of that, unless you're going on holidays to some far-flung island, people forget about the Australian Jewish community. But as an Australian Jew who's been living in this country, my family's been here for 160 years. And the history of Jews in Australia is a fascinating one. So the first boat, the first fleet full of prisoners from England arrives in Australia in 1770. And on that boat, there are, a few thousand people, but amongst those people are 9 Jewish people, prisoners. One of the most famous one is Esther Abrahams. I mean, she sounds like probably your aunt or your cousin. She stole like a loaf of bread. The people, the prisoners, the convicts from England that came here had committed some low-level crimes. They stole a roll of lace, a loaf of bread. The prisons in England were overcrowded and they sent them to the New World, to Australia. So in 1770, as these first boats arrive, 9 Jews are part of this original first fleet. And since then, Australian Jews have lived in this country. So we've been here right from the beginning of colonization of Australia. And it's been an interesting experience. My personal story is, I think, unique for an Australian Jew. There was obviously the Californian gold rush in I think it's the 1840s. And in Victoria, the state that I live in, there are some Californians who come across. They're in Australia. They're just visiting. and they're in a place called Ballarat. It's about an hour from where I live. And they're hanging out, they're looking, and they say, hey, this is kind of weird because the soil that they're looking at, they think this kind of looks like we've just come from in California. So they get some gold pans and they're like, look, we're pretty far from home and we're pretty far from the gold rush where we were just hanging out in California, but let's just check if there's anything here because they notice that the terrain looks similar. So they get some pans, they go to the river, they pan for gold, and straight away there's massive amounts of alluvial gold. That means gold that sort of sits on the surface. These days we've taken so much gold out of the earth that you have to dig into the quartz and you have to, smelt and refine, a ton of quartz for like a fingernail worth of gold. But they pan a little bit and there's so much gold in this area that it's literally sitting on the surface. And they go back into town, they're like, oh my gosh, look what we just found. And straight away, it causes a gold rush because everyone is like, oh my God, there's so much money to be made. So my personal family, on my mum's side of the family, we're gold rush Jews. They came from Russia in 1860s to Australia. And that's a little bit unusual. They have a shul in Ballarat, which is the third oldest shul in Australia and the oldest shul on the Australian mainland that they founded in like the 1880s, and it still exists. And they're next week at Rosh Hashanah, they're going to be hosting services. Jews don't really live out there anymore, but it's this beautiful old historic shul. And as you can imagine, the Jews that came to the gold rush made a lot of money. So this shul is a beautiful old building with gold rush money. And that's how my family arrived here. And in Ballarat, that's like it was a melting pot for immigration to Australia. So it's, almost 100 years after the first fleet arrives, these prisoners who are setting up colonies all across Australia, in Melbourne and Sydney, in Rose Bay, all across. And the Jews arrive at the beginning. More Jews arrive in the 1860s for the gold rush, which is on my mum's side of the family. And they're even buried in the Jewish section of the Ballarat cemetery. And then beyond that, there's a trickle of immigration. You have, a few people after the First World War, but it's not a large community. The Jewish community in Australia really takes off after the Second World War. And outside of Israel, Australia becomes the #1 destination per capita for Holocaust survivors. So you had a little bit of Jewish infrastructure. You had a few shuls. You had some, institutions. You had a Yiddish theater, which started after the First World War, but there weren't really Jewish schools. That happens when the Holocaust survivors arrive. So on my dad's side of the family, we're part of that mass wave of Holocaust survivor immigration. And it's interesting because so many Jews in this country are the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. It was not unusual. Probably 80% of my class at school had a grandparent who was a Holocaust survivor who came here. And there's about 120,000 Jews in Australia out of a greater population of about 26 million. But in general, it was a smaller community until the 1950s and 60s. And to understand why the Holocaust survivors came here is, I guess, an exercise in understanding a little bit of the problematic history of Australia. So they come here for a few reasons. They come here because it's really, really far. In general, I'm speaking to you from the future. It's Thursday morning. Australia, if you want to fly from New York, it is 21 hours in the most direct way. So you'll go like JFK to Auckland in New Zealand, which is 17.5 hours, which is one of the longest flights in the world. And then another 3.5 hours from Auckland to Melbourne, where I live, or like 4 hours to Sydney, which is, the state over. So if you want to run away from the horrors of Europe, you've been in Europe, like my Zeta's family, my grandfather's family had been there for hundreds of years. He's a sole survivor. His mother is murdered. His father is murdered. His older sister is murdered. His younger brother is murdered. And he wants to get away as far as possible. Australia is a pretty good destination. And historically, and I'm going to get into this later, this is not a country that has had systemic anti-Semitism like many places in Europe have. So you can look at the history of Europe and there's, oh my gosh, from time immemorial, they don't like us as Jews. We're wearing these little, hats and we have these yellow patches, and the Holocaust culminates in, 1,000 years of anti-Semitism in Europe. and we end up, with 6 million dead. Australia is different because Jews arrived here as part of this penal colony that England had set up. You had, of course, individual isolated incidents of anti-Semitism, but there's no history of it. It's not like you're going to go back 300 years where your great-grandfather and my great-grandfather have been fighting about anti-Semitism like we do in Europe. Australia is different. We don't have systemic, sustained anti-Jewish legislation. So you want to get really, really far away from Europe because you've had a horrible time. You want to go to a country that doesn't have systemic anti-Semitism. So why not come to Australia? And we were going through a boon at the time. In the 1950s, Australia needed people, and we had a problematic policy. We had something called a white Australia policy, where we only wanted white people into Australia. So they restricted immigration from any countries where there were black people. You weren't allowed to come. And they didn't really let Asian people in, but they let in, I guess, people who were considered white enough. So Jews from Europe were considered white enough, so they're allowed to come. You had waves of migration from countries like Greece, from Italy, and you have these still massive enclaves in Australia, these beautiful, we have such good coffee in this country because the Italians brought their coffee, or we have amazing bakeries and multicultural foods because we had all these waves of migration. So as the country is growing, and they are being racist in their immigration policies, Jews sort of start to fit into this little niche, narrow slice of who Australia is going to accept. So people decide to take the opportunity. So they arrive here. And when they arrive, they find a country that is basically ripe for opportunities. My grandfather came to this country as a penniless orphan. And by the time he passed away in 2016, he had been a successful businessman who had been able to build himself up. And that happened. So many of the most successful families in Australia are the Holocaust survivors who came here with literally nothing in their pockets. And if you look at Australia's rich list, some of those families are the Holocaust survivors and children of Holocaust survivors who came with nothing. And not only were they successful, they were extraordinarily successful and blessed by Hashem for the kind of wealth that they endured. So as these Holocaust survivors come, they start setting up more infrastructure. They set up, some of the big schools. They don't forget the terrible time that they've had in Europe. So the biggest Jewish day school in Australia is called Mount Scopus Memorial College. What's it a memorial of? It's a memorial of all the parents and siblings of these children who didn't make it out of Europe. And the Holocaust is very much imprinted on the psyche of Australian Jewry. So my family's been here much longer, but most families will start tracing to that 1940s, 50s, and 60s period. And like I said, outside of Israel, this is the largest community of survivors. And the Jews begin to rebuild their lives. So they set up shuls and they set up schools. And I think what people find surprising about when they come to Australia is just how vibrant our communities are. We are very self-sufficient. So we obviously look to the bigger communities like in New York and Jerusalem. But in general, we have everything we need here. Some communities that are far from the global Jewish centers maybe struggle a bit. So, Australia's closest neighbor is New Zealand, and it's a beautiful place, but it's a very, very small community of 5,000 Jews. And they rely on Australia for a lot of their Jewish services. Like for many years, if you had a little baby boy and you needed a circumcision, the mohel, the doctor who can circumcise this baby, would fly to New Zealand, which is like a 5-hour flight to circumcise this baby. Or if you wanted shechita, kosher meat, you would get the shochet, the ritual slaughterer from Australia, to fly to New Zealand to produce those services for the community. Any sort of conversion from even most of this Southern Hemisphere area outside of South America. So anyone from Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan, a lot of the conversion actually goes through Sydney's Beth Din. So Australia is quite self-sufficient. We have everything you want to send. We have, in my town of Melbourne, It's about 60,000 Jews, maybe a touch more. It's about half of Australia's Jews. We have everything. We have, 9 or 10 Jewish day schools to choose from, 100 synagogues. Australian Jews are interesting. I would say only about 10% of the community is Orthodox. Maybe even that's a high estimate. But most Jews prefer to belong to an Orthodox synagogue. So they're traditional. So they don't keep Shabbat necessarily. They don't keep kosher. I mean, they're not eating like bacon and ham, but they're not keeping such strict kosher, but they want to belong to a synagogue that I guess for them feels traditional. We have a handful of reform temples here. In my city of Melbourne, we have one single conservative synagogue, and the rest are Orthodox, even though the majority of the congregants of these synagogues are not Orthodox. If you trace the history of our community, one of the first places that received shluchim, emissaries from the Chabad Rebbe, was actually Melbourne, Australia, the city I live in. So Chabad has a very strong presence here. They set up shuls, schools, institutions. And I guess when people come here, they are sometimes surprised at the strength of Chabad in Australia. But it was one of the first places, like I said, that the Lubavitcher Rebbe sent emissaries to, and to set up the infrastructure of this community. And it's not unusual in Melbourne to have a Chabad ordained rabbi be the head of a modern Orthodox or non-Chabad shul. That's a phenomenon here. Because when you are so far from the rest of the world, and yes, we are self-sufficient and we have everything we need here, but sometimes people are a little bit reluctant. Like if you live in New York, why do you want to come and live in Australia? That's really far from your family and your home and everything you know. And culturally, it's not so different, but it is different. And people don't want to necessarily live here. So we have a very strong, we have a Chabad yeshiva here, which ordains rabbis, like a yeshiva gedola. And so a lot of them who stay, that's who's available here. And they're very talented and they go into the synagogues. And in general, if you want vibrant Jewish culture, we have everything here, from the Yiddish theater to the Jewish Comedy Festival, to the Jewish Book Festival, to the Jewish Film Festival, to the Jewish Food Festival. It's busy, it's vibrant any day of the week. We have all these guests, and I guess on some level, Australia, because it is so far from everything, people like the idea of coming here. If you're never going to go to Australia, but the JNF in Australia is offering you a trip to talk about Israel. Like, it's fun, it's exciting, it's different. Rachel Goldberg Poland and her husband John, the parents of the murdered hostage Hirsch Goldberg Poland, actually came to Australia a few months ago. And it was very, very interesting to hear her talk, because she came here as a student 30 years ago at the university. I think it was the University of Melbourne. She came on exchange. And while she was here, she connected and used to eat by local families who, the grandparents were Holocaust survivors. And when she came and spoke to our community, she said she gets a lot of chizuk, a lot of strength from the fact that she met these Holocaust survivors and they told her how they went on with their lives and rebuilt from the ashes, even in the face of great adversity and very tough conditions, to come as an orphan. And she wanted to come back to our community, even though it's so far from the rest of the world, and even though she's an in-demand speaker, because lots of that wisdom that she had received as a student, she was now drawing on in her terrible journey of grief and suffering since her son was murdered. So if you want to understand the makeup of the majority of Australian Jews, I think it's 5 or 10 years, the big universities will do they call it I think the last time they did it was 2017. So it's called Gen 17, and they'll survey the Jews that live across the country, and they'll try and understand, how do you feel about Israel? Do you send your children to Jewish schools? What is the rate of intermarriage in this community? And in many ways, Australia feels like perhaps a throwback to what America was like 30 or 40 years ago. The rate of intermarriage in Australia is lower than America and other places, and the rate at which Jewish families send their children to Jewish day schools is significantly higher. And I would just say for lots of these things, the demographers have looked at some of this data and they've thought, is it because these are the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors that they felt guilty perhaps to marry outside of the faith or not educate their children Jewishly? And there is perhaps an element of that because some of the newer data seems to suggest that maybe Australian Jews' rates of intermarriage are growing and the rate at which children go to Jewish schools is dropping. But it's always interesting for an American to have a look at our data and say, wow, this community is so vibrant, like very, very busy and lots of stuff happening. And there is a small but growing section of our community which perhaps don't identify with Israel as much as previous generations, but overwhelmingly, the community in Australia is a very Zionist community. I learnt Hebrew at my Jewish day school in Melbourne. My Hebrew is, thank God, really good. It's excellent. I can converse, I can read, I can speak, I can listen to Hebrew podcasts. Although we live in the future, we're a day ahead. I felt very connected to Israel, along with 100 other youngsters. I went on a gap year and spent a year studying at Midreshet Harova in the old city of Jerusalem, and spent a gap year there with my Bnei Akiva youth movement. We have vibrant youth movements that, go the whole spectrum from Zionist, like religious Zionist to secular. And a lot of the history of this community, if you understand it, is based on who immigrated here. So if I would do a little jump around Australia, you have 60,000 Jews in Melbourne, roughly 40,000 in Sydney, and then the rest of the country, like a smaller, so 5,000 in Queensland. You have 100 Jews who live in Darwin, which is in our Northern Territory, where the big rock, the Uluru, is in Australia. You have about 8,000 in Perth. I don't know how many live in South Australia. Probably like 2,000, something like that. And then there's Tasmania, the little state at the bottom of Australia, which I guess it suffers from sometimes being left off the map. I know the Chabad rabbi down in Launceston, Rabbi Yochanan Gordon. What a special, sweet man, living really very far place. It's quite isolated, although it's an hour and a half flight to Melbourne, my city. And he has the luxury of being the rabbi of the oldest shul in Australia. They were built because the original penal colony boat arrived in Tasmania. That was the first stop. And the 9 Jews got off there and they built 2 shuls. And it's a fascinating quirk of history where if you go to the Launceston Synagogue in Tasmania, so it's that little island at the bottom of Australia, they have these benches for everyone to pray in the synagogue. But at the front, they have the benches and they have these little dips in the ground. And what's it for? It's for the Jews who are convicts, prisoners, because they had to arrive with their chains and they needed somewhere to park their like ball and chain. So the shul has it inbuilt into the ground. So that's fascinating. There's around 300 Jews, according to in 2021, Australia does a census every 5 years, so we count all the people. So we're due for one next year, but in 2021, there was 330 Jews in Tasmania. And when I spoke to the rabbi, it was quite exciting because officially the number of Jews had actually doubled since the last census, which had been, I think, in 2016. And when I called him up, I was like, what is happening? Why are so many Jews living in Tasmania? And I remember he told me, well, let me tell you something, Nomi. And I said, yes, tell me. He said, I know personally 1,000 Jews who live in Tasmania, so 330 is nothing. And I guess housing is a little cheaper there, so he has his work cut out for him, going around Tasmania, taking care of all the Jews. I love my community. I love being an Australian Jew. I think it's fascinating. I think it's different. I love being part of this super vibrant, self-sufficient community that is so connected with Israel, that loves our heritage, that feels proud to be Australian. And if you would have asked me, do I want to live anywhere else? I would have said no. This is where I want to raise my family. My husband is Australian. We were at the same school. He was 1 grade older than me. His parents live 2 streets down from where we live. My parents live 3 streets up from where we live. There are a few in Melbourne, there's a few little Jewish enclave suburbs where like 40–50% of the people are Jewish. It's not a whole heap of suburbs, you know, there's Caulfield, Eastern Kilda, Ripponley, I'm just saying South Caulfield. So I live in Caulfield and I have everything I need here. The shul is 100 meters from my house. My children's school is a 5-minute drive. I have kosher restaurants down the street. The Jewish library is very close to my house. I have amazing events, great friends. Outside of my friends who moved to Israel, most of my friends still live here. They like living here. And if you look at the history of Australia, historically, being Jewish wasn't seen as any sort of barrier to success. You have some of the most eminent business leaders and politicians are Jewish in this country. And it's been that way since the beginning, because like I said, there's not been institutional anti-Semitism in Australia. So, you know, we had a Jewish treasurer of Australia just during the pandemic. He was in charge of the response. Or you have an attorney general who I worked for who's Jewish, not for the whole country. And so, does it matter that you're Jewish? No, not really. Jewish, if you go to any of the buildings, the public hospitals, philanthropy, the arts, all these Jewish names are donating these beautiful galleries and exhibitions. And people live here, their children live here, their grandchildren live here, they've been happy living here. And historically, when there were wars with Israel, tension would sometimes rise. It wouldn't always be great. It wouldn't be like, oh, okay, we're totally immune. You would get individual incidents. But then October 7th happens, and it feels like being Jewish in this country, unfortunately, has changed. And it's been quite shocking for the Jews that live here. Because if you think about the history of this community, you have Holocaust survivors who come here because they want to get as far away from the anti-Jewish hate as possible. And they want to live a peaceful life. And for the last, 80, 90 years since they got here, it's been pretty peaceful. It's been a good life. They went into all their chosen careers and they've been successful and their children have been successful. And then what happens on October 9th? It's the images that go viral around the world. It's in Sydney, outside the Sydney Opera House, which is, a central area of Sydney. And they're chanting a mob. It's 2 days after October 7th. Israel hasn't buried their dead. They haven't even evicted the last terrorists who are still running around southern Israel. The Jewish world is totally in shock. 1,200 Jews have been murdered. And in a community like mine, which is so intrinsically connected to the history of the Holocaust, and we feel it so deeply because it's not random people to us. It's our parents and our grandparents and our aunties and our uncles and the family members we never got to meet. And you're hearing that for the first time ever, 1,200 Jews have been murdered in Israel, and there was no army defense. And it's going to take a lifetime to unpack exactly what went wrong. So we feel vulnerable as a people. And we are in Australia, a place we've always felt safe, which has always been a good country to live in. And as far as the majority of Australian Jews are concerned, this is somewhere we want to continue to live. And it's October 9th. And there's a mob of people chanting outside one of the central and most known landmark, one of the most famous landmarks in Australia. You ask anyone, what's Australia? They say the Sydney Opera House and the Harbour Bridge, or maybe the Rock, Uluru. And they're chanting, "Gas the Jews, where are the Jews?" And as Jewish people, we saw those images and they went viral around the world. And we thought, what has happened to this country that we have always loved and felt part of and been a part of? And there was an Australian Jew who was there and he had an Israeli flag, and the police arrested him and removed him for his own safety. But no one who chanted, "Where are the Jews?" or "F the Jews" got arrested. And that seems to have set off a spate of troubling incidents where, as Australian Jews, we don't feel so secure anymore. And it's been, in some ways, a very dreadful wake-up call, right? Because if I've always loved living here and I've always wanted to live here and I haven't wanted to ever go anywhere else, I start thinking, wait, if they're starting to burn down shuls, like they did at the Adass Israel synagogue, which is around the corner from where I live, and this shul, which is, built by Holocaust survivors in the 1950s and is burnt to the ground, and they are defacing Jewish institutions, so daubing swastikas on Jewish houses, trying to burn down the house of the co-convener of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, our peak body. And if Jews are starting to feel threatened, now institutions vulnerable, and they're trying to burn down a kosher kitchen in Sydney, and they're daubing graffiti on Jewish schools, like at Mount Scopus Memorial College, Jew die. Do I want to live here anymore? Am I safe here anymore? Am I going to regret not leaving when I still could? And it's, I guess, in part because of the trauma of my history and so many Australian Jews' history, we feel it more than other communities. And I just want to be clear about a few things. During the Holocaust, the government colluded with people who committed anti-Semitic attacks. There was no consequence for any of that. And the government, in fact, provided the lists for Roundup. So the Australian government is not like that. The Australian government officially has given money to synagogues for security upgrades. When there has been any sort of serious events like the burning down of the Adass Israel synagogue, the Prime Minister came to show support to our community and came and did a visit and pledged to rebuild it in its entirety, much more beautiful and much bigger than it ever was. So they're going to have a beautiful, beautiful, amazing building at the end of this with state-of-the-art facilities and beautiful security. But the Australian government in general, the sort of perception on the ground for Australian Jews is that they haven't been great. It's a little bit wishy-washy. For 18 months in my city of Melbourne, we have had weekly protests against Israel's war by pro-Palestine protesters in the Melbourne city, in the business district. So, thousands of people every single week. And they engage in violent behavior. They'll burn the Israeli flag. They'll chant things like all Zionists are terrorists. They will, they're very clever in their approach because they'll never say Jew, but they'll code switch and call us Zionists, Zionist conspiracy, that kind of thing. And they accuse us of all kinds of terrible atrocities that we haven't done. There was a restaurant, literally, probably like a 3-minute walk from my house, that got burnt down in an arson attack. And it was owned by a Palestinian Australian businessman. And when I saw the footage, I thought, oh, that's horrible. But when other people saw the footage, they said, oh, it must be Zionists who are doing this, who burnt down this restaurant in order to get back at him because he's a Palestinian Australian who's leading the protest movement. And they called it a false flag operation. So we as Jews burnt it down so then we can, get back at him and pretend that, we can get sympathy. That's patently false. But the government, because Australia has interesting laws, right? In America, you have freedom of speech. In Australia, we don't have freedom of speech. It's a little bit more nuanced. You have a level of freedom, but we have race hate laws. So if you vilify or you cause someone to be the recipient of hate, you're actually not allowed to speak in that manner. It's stricter than that, than the American approach. So if you're going to, in America, you really have freedom of speech. In Australia, if your speech causes someone to be vilified or be the subject of hate, you can actually be prosecuted for that speech. And the government in general has been a bit wishy-washy. Our community keeps saying we don't feel safe. We feel like there's incitement against us. We feel like we're being vilified. But yet every single week for, we're coming up to 2 years, there've been these protests in the city where Jews cannot go near the city while these protests are happening. And I'm a lawyer, so I think that this kind of matter has to be balanced carefully because I don't want to go to any of these protests. I've got a lot of kids I've got weekend plans. I'm not going to protest on a Sunday. But anytime there's a small group of Jews who want to go into the city to stage a counter protest, the police either don't have the resources to protect them, so they'll immediately move them on, or they'll say that there's too much of a, perceived risk of harm or danger, so they don't let them protest in the city. So I think that if you're going to give one group the right to protest, it has to be the other group also given the same rights. And I think that, it's been a bit patchy. And I think that in general, because the police are on the front line and they are the ones that are enforcing lots of these thorny issues and complicated sort of, nuanced areas of the law, they haven't got the training, the resources, and the know-how to police. Or they may not understand why something like all Zionists are terrorists is in fact vilification. And our community bodies have tried very hard, as Australian Jews have tried very hard to convey that to the government. And on occasion, we've got a little bit of legislation. So, you can't do, what was it, a Nazi salute. It's been outlawed now. But a lot of this sort of vilification and speech hasn't been properly policed and hasn't been properly enforced. And to this day, it's not really well understood why at that protest on the 9th of October, where there's a group of people chanting, "Gas the Jews, where are the Jews?" Well, I don't know if they said "Gas the Jews." "Where are the Jews? F the Jews." Why did nobody get arrested? They burnt an Israeli flag. We have legislation on our books that doesn't allow you to do that. So why wasn't there any sort of consequence? And if there is no sort of tangible consequence, well, what does that say to people who are thinking about committing violence against Jews? We've had an interesting dimension to all of this as well, because in the last few weeks, the Prime Minister of Australia basically said that Iran had directed Australians to commit offences. So the government hasn't given us the precise information, but, they made a press conference and announced that some of the people they had arrested for burning down the synagogue and committing the arson attack had been Australians who had mob connections, who effectively were hired by people on Telegram and had committed the offence. And on some level, I mean, the whole thing is terrible, but on some level, it's comforting to know that it's not someone who's so motivated by hate of Jews that they come and burn down a synagogue. But on the other hand, for years, Israel has been saying Iran is trying to commit offences in Jewish communities and soft underbelly of the Jewish community. Australia is that. We're a little bit out of it. So if Iran is trying to commit attacks on this soft underbelly of our Jewish community, communities are a little bit off the beaten track, not necessarily on the radar. Why weren't we on top of it in Australia? Why, if we want Jews to feel safe, we have to feel safe going to shul. We have to feel safe that, our intelligence agencies understand that these nefarious players and these nefarious countries like Iran are meddling in our community, trying to destroy social cohesion and the social fabric of Australia. And you want to see a really tough, proactive response. And I think that there's still a bit of work to do on that front. I don't think the government has nailed it. I don't think that they've been tough enough on incitement. I don't think they've done a great job at sort of balancing free speech considerations and vilification. And if they're only giving one side the right to protest but not the other because they don't have enough resources, I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's upholding the spirit of the law in the way that it's intended. And for the first time ever, many, many Jews are thinking about, do we have a future in this country, a country that we've loved, a country we have contributed to, a country that we have been overwhelmingly successful with? But do we want to keep living here if this is what life is going to be like? Where people can say, F the Jews in the main square of Australia and get away with it. My son goes to a Hebrew school that's, very close to my house. And I picked him up one afternoon. He wasn't feeling well, so I picked him up early. And they were practicing an active shooting drill. Now, I know for Americans that might not be so strange, unfortunately. But Australia in 1995, we had a mass shooting in a place called Port Arthur in Tasmania, and we got rid of all the guns in our country. So if you want to own a gun, it's very, very complicated. You have to apply to a shooting club. There's strict licensing. You have to show that you have a purpose. So you're a farmer or you belong to a shooting club. So in general, gun crime is very, very low in Australia. We have other issues, but gun crime is very, very low. So to have active shooter drills is terrifying. I mean, it's terrifying for anyone, but especially in Australia where there aren't easily accessible guns, like unlike in America. And if you want to go into any sort of Jewish institution, my friend hadn't been to synagogue in a long time, and it's her family synagogue. And she said, Nomi, I'll tell you what, the craziest thing about it, I hadn't been there in a few years, but to see since 2015 till now, how much security there is. You want to go to any Jewish institution in Australia, and this is not how Australians live. This is how Jews in Australia live. It's like a fortress. There's barbed wire, there's airlocking doors, there's a security guard out front, and it's at the cost the institution. The synagogue near me pays for their private security every single day of the week. And you know, it's funny, when I was at university, I was allocated to mentor a non-Jewish student who was the first in her family to go to university. So I drove about an hour from where I lived to one of the sort of outer suburbs, and I arrived at her day school, and I was blown away. And it showed, I guess, how insular perhaps my upbringing had been, because I had always gone to a Jewish school where there had always been security guards and high fences and, you know, strict locks and all that kind of thing. But I remember going to this public school about an hour from where I live and walking into the school with no fence and thinking, am I going to get into trouble? Where is the security? And I remember wandering into the front office and nobody cared I was there. And I walked into the actual school and found the child that I was mentoring, and I thought, oh my gosh, this would have never happened in a Jewish school. You couldn't. I remember when I was a debater in my senior year of high school, they couldn't put the debating competition at my Jewish school, even though we were in the finals, because the security requirements were so hard after school. So they just put it in a different grammar school. And at some point you want to ask yourself, do we want to live like this? Do we want to live with higher fences and more security? That's not how average Australians live. And some people say, oh, you guys were always dramatic, but I don't think it's dramatic now. When I never thought it was dramatic, but even more so now, after Adas Israel Synagogue was burnt down. There's arson attacks against Jewish leaders in Sydney. There was an attempted arson attack of the East Melbourne Hebrew congregation, which is where my great-grandparents got married in 1920, where there seems to be sustained threats, and it's not limited to one area. It's not just Jews who are involved in Israel advocacy. It's Jews in the arts, in philanthropy, Zionist Jews, non-Zionist Jews, just appears to be Jews. And then you get worried, because are we in a situation? I always used to ask my grandfather, I always used to say to him, why didn't your family leave? Why didn't Opapa leave? My great-grandfather, his father. You guys were well-to-do. You're from Bratislava in Czechoslovakia. Why didn't you leave? It was bad for a while. And he said it wasn't so simple. You know, they had businesses, they had houses, they had lives, they had mortgages, and they thought things would get better. So if you're asking me, I still think that there is a chance that things will improve in Australia. And I think I'm hopeful that things will get better. But then I also worry at the same time, am I being stupid to stay in this country and not read the warning signs? And because of that history of Holocaust that hangs over the whole Australian Jewish experience, are we going to leave it too late? I got some figures from the Zionist Federation Australia, which showed that there had been an increase in Australian Jews who had been making Aliyah. And the Zionist Federation wanted me to be clear and say that the vast majority of people that make Aliyah from Australia do not do so because of anti-Semitism, and they would categorically reject that assertion that they're leaving because of anti-Semitism. But at the same time, I think people are worried. I think people are starting to consider their place in society. And do I hope in a year from now I speak to you and I say to you, things are so much better, and to be an Australian Jew is an amazing experience like it's always been historically? I hope I tell you yes. But due to my history, my family history, and the history of so many people who founded this community and came here with the baggage and the trauma of being the sole survivors in their family, I'm also worried, and I would be lying if I said I wasn't worried about the direction of this community and where we're headed. I know that at Rosh Hashanah next week, there will be thousands of Jews going to synagogue. And like I said, not so many people go on a week-to-week basis, but there will be thousands of people. It'll be the big day. Lots of people there, as we call it, like the grand final. And in Australia, it's going into summer. We're in spring. We have opposite seasons to you. So the school year is winding down, finishes in December. So, we're at the end of September. There's 2 months left. And everybody's going to go into their synagogues and they're going to want to hear from their rabbis and they're going to want to hear the message. And I know a lot of rabbis will talk about the situation on the ground in Australia, how it's been very much less than ideal in the past year. But I also think that as Jews, we can't be sitting ducks. We have to be vigilant. But our tradition also gives us tools within this vigilance and, increasing our security and doing all the appropriate things. We're told to increase our actions of goodness and kindness and mitzvot and observance because everything is from Hashem. And if we want to, strengthen ourselves, we do it obviously with the external facing factors like the security and the fences, but also as Jews, if we cleave to our tradition, and at this time of Elul, Tshuva, Tefillah, Tzedakah, we have the opportunity to also beseech some help from heaven at this trying time in our history. I think that's it for me. Does anyone have any questions? I hope it was interesting.
It was very interesting. That was all pretty much news to me. I found the first half fascinating to learn about what it's like to be in the Jewish community in Australia, and I was looking up maps and stuff during it because I wanted to see exactly like where you were talking about. And then fascinating to hear the update of what's going on now. So thank you so much. If people can find you anywhere online or want to reach out, maybe you want to shout that out.
I'm on Twitter. I'm on X, Nomi Kal, Nomi.kal. So you can DM me there. I have a website, nomikaltmann.com. So you can come through my inbox if you have any specific questions. But yeah, in general, I think that next time you read about the Jewish world, it's definitely fascinating to look at Australia and the history of Australia because it's a cool community. And if you ever find yourself here for Shabbat along the way, along the journey, or visiting for some sort of amazing reason, whether it's touring or traveling or talking, whatever it is, I'm very happy to host people for Shabbat and hear from my American Jewish brothers and sisters.
Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day and Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.